The wise men of Ionia perceived long ago that water, air, or fire, by metamorphosis, might make up the whole life of nature. This is now being rediscovered, but with two interesting differences. Exploration and mathematics have changed the scale of our science. We are acquainted with distance outwards and inwards. On the other hand, religion and romanticism have established the troubled reign of subjectivity and have endowed immediate experience with a kind of authority which the maritime Greeks, keen-eyed but practical and argumentative, have never dreamt of. They looked in order to understand and to possess, whereas our philosophy, if not our instinct, reverts with relief from understanding and possession to aesthetic life, as to a surer foundation. Our cosmology has spirited away that living substance which, like Zeus, had many names, but under all of them was felt to be fatally revolving, plastic and mighty. Air has been attenuated to space, the fluid to motion, fire to light, ambiguous essences which are thought of as existing in nature and forming its elements, yet are also names for feeling or ghostly concepts floating before the mind. And to these last, the modern philosopher, when pressed, is inclined to reduce them. Why shouldn't some astronomer with one foot in idealism tell us that the universe is nothing but light? If we forget that we eat, work, and die, if we forget that we are animals, we might not plausibly think that nothing exists save a certain colored brightness playing in vacuo. And what is consciousness, which in the 19th century passed for the only reality, but an active and burning light? May not formal science too be invoked to prove that light is the only revealer and measurer of the material universe? And yet this light, which should be the source of clearness, is itself the most obscure of things, and its name the most ambiguous of names. For in physics, light is understood to be a mysterious agency coursing through space, material in that it has a measurable velocity and does material work, and is a form of vibration or radiation emitted by bodies when ignited, and intercepted and reflected by them even when opaque. It traverses space unceasingly in 1,000 directions, leaving it perfectly black and cold. This light is invisible; only gross matter shedding it or catching it can become bright. Plants and blind animals, and even the human eye is blind to some of its rays, may bask in it with profit, being deeply penetrated by its electric warmth, as by the healing shafts of Apollo. To call this cosmic agency light is a poetic metaphor, as if we called it Phoebus, which indeed we might do without absurdity, since Apollo, besides his golden locks, had his invisible arrows, and these were the dread reality of the god. Only the obvious essence of brightness shining in intuition is light proper. This is no insidious power, but an open gift, vouchsafed from moment to moment, like daily bread to the spirit, an essence appearing and vanishing as we open or shut the eyes, an intensive quality, aesthetic and emotional, proper to images of color or visual patterns. It has no velocity or direction or substance or pertinacity. It is incapable of warming anything or doing any work. It is obvious but cannot be caught, proportionate but not to be measured, remote in its spiritual presence from all the functions of that cosmic fire which, according to Heraclitus, shaped, animated, and devoured everything. Yet this visionary light, which can burn only in the hearth of the soul, lends its name to that mathematical measure of astronomical distances. In one sense, light is the messenger of matter, and carries the eye through time and space almost to infinity. And if we trust its reports, dehumanizes the universe. But in another sense, it tinctures this same universe with a surreptitious humanity, for it seems to reduce everything to immediate experience, to the focus of intuition at any moment in any man, so that both its substance and its measure seem to become aesthetic. Thus, the dominance of light in its two acceptations marks the two developments and the fundamental confusion by which modern cosmology differs from that of the ancients. That the realm of matter, in its own way, is spatial and temporal follows from the conception of this realm as the field of action. In action, one state of things must pass into another. Something must be precipitated. In each direction, each degree of change must be distinguished from all others, which are its alternatives. Substance, if it is to flow and to have parts, must be distributed in centers, each a focus of external and transitional relations with the rest. Interaction and genesis involve this sort of space and time, or create them. But what this physical space or time may properly be, we can know perfectly only by knowing perfectly the intimate movement and ultimate ranges of matter, not a human task. We know matter as it behooves us to know it. In the measure in which our highly selective action and mental chronicle of action penetrate into its meshes. And presently I shall say something concerning our share in this general flux of existence and our ways of noting it. Physical space and time are integral elements in this realm of matter. They are physical, which is as much as to say that they are contingent, to be explored by experiment rather than by reasoning, to be shared by us rather than contemplated. They may change their form if they choose, like any existence, and may manifest a different essence in their new instances. It is therefore a problem never to be solved except provisionally and locally. How far a human sensation of sentimental time or of pictorial space, or how far any geometrical model of a pure space or time may fitly express the temporal and spatial dimensions of nature, or be a true measure for them, over the field of action in which we exist, logic, which is but our way of thinking, can have no prior control. Substance did not drop into a world with a previous constitution. It was not obliged to squeeze itself into atoms or to spread itself through infinities so as to verify the precipitate fancies of future philosophers. To ask whether substance must be discrete or continuous, finite or infinite, many or one, is like asking whether the Almighty must think in French or in English. Having no competence in that sphere, why should we have any preferences? Let physical time and space be infinite or finite, discrete or continuous, unreturning or circular, multiplex or single. These would be curious and impressive truths, if they were discoverable, and too great for ignorant opinion. Meantime, the practical arts retain a great advantage over the speculation which seeks to elucidate them. They deal directly with matter, whereas a graphic or dialectical analysis can be immediately concerned only with images which are symbols, or with symbols which are words. And the act of measuring is an actual transition, like a journey. Both the meter and the thing measured are material and equally internal to the flux of substance. The measure is then congruous and literal, and the disadvantage of perhaps leaving no precise image in intuition, for what, to intuition, is a pace or a mile, is counterbalanced by the advantage of bridging truly external relations and catching nature in her own net. A graphic calculus or a map may afterwards be constructed to give definition and a common denominator to the parts of this past or possible performance, and to display it as a whole to intuition, but now in another realm of being from that in which it might actually occur, for it would occur in the realm of matter, and it is surveyed as an essence. This is not a defect in the survey, but the condition of inspection or retrospect, which is the translation of an event into an idea, not a repetition of the same event. As literature is but childish exclamation modulated and transcribed, so scientific imagination is but sensation studied and defined. Instead of the flying miscellany of natural images, vivid but treacherous tokens of what nature is doing, science sets up an idol, simpler and more dignified, but still only an idea. Mathematical space and time are sublimated essences of this sort. They cannot appear in sense as they are defined to be infinite, equable, and pure, yet they remain specious or ideal in their nature, purified extensions or generalizations of the imagery of sense. It is contact with matter, patient empirical art, that guides this idealization, so that the Egyptian blocks may be fit and foursquare, and the planets may not belie the prophet. And this advance in the validity and precision of the symbols used, in spite of their greater tenuity, causes them to be mistaken, as the crude images of sense were at first, for the very essence of matter. Having erected and polished our mathematical idol, we suppose ourselves to behold intuitively what space and time are physically. We even feel confident that it is impossible for them not to exist, or to exist otherwise. The clearness and necessity native to essence when kept in its own realm are thus attributed to the realm of matter, where all is profound fertility and darkness. And having discarded one or two optical illusions, and straightened out one or two perspectives in religious legend, we feel all the freer to endow the residue of our imaginative baggage with a perfect substantiality. We might have done better, perhaps, like the animals or the saints, if we had continued to trust instinctively in the secret harmonies of the realm of matter or of the kingdom of God. We might have lived on imaginatively in the world of poetry, which is often pragmatic and hygienic enough. But there are natural stages and shifts in human ideation. Every age has its peculiar insights and new illusions. The terms of science, like those of sense, are essences describing in human discourse the objects encountered in action. This relative function removes them, and ought to remove them, from any passive or complete iteration of the realm of matter in its intrinsic essence. When the mathematician applies his calculus to nature, he does so tentatively, after having taken a hint from nature herself, by selecting for his unit some simple image which action and comparison of cases have shown to have prophetic value. And in his most wonderful successes, if he is wise, he keeps his distance and his sense of abstraction. Here lies the legitimate magic of poetic intuitions, such as are these intuitions of time and space, that, being incarnations of spirit on some animal occasion, they have a double affinity, here to spirit and there to matter, and that with the authority proper to their intended object they associate the form and accent of the free symbol which names it. What was only interaction becomes also perception, and what was a process becomes also a drama. And these moral overtones on their new emotional plane are the first ideas, the beginnings of knowledge of their natural occasions. If we ask how it happens that quite fresh essences, spontaneously evoked in intuition, like sounds or words or mathematical fictions, can nevertheless apply to nature, the answer is not far to seek. Ideas applied to their occasions because they arise out of them, mark them, and are a part of the total natural event which controls their development. Mind is a great symptom of health. It appears at victorious moments, changes with them, and recalls them. Even its confusions and agonies are but conflicts in its domination. It would not be there to die if harmony had not given it birth. The aesthetic originality of sensations and ideas is therefore an innocent privilege if their practical connections are knit together harmoniously with the environing flux of events. And on the same plane, they must be so knit because sensations and ideas arise only when living beings are actively adjusting or secretly readjusting their powers. If the adjustment to the moving environment were perfect, the essences evoked in thought, whatever notes they might freely strike aesthetically, would apply or work perfectly in practice. For it is not the ideas that work there, but the men in whom the ideas have arisen. Moreover, in applying any idea, a man must start from a material center, his own body, and must use a material scale, since neither center nor scale can be furnished by logic. Numbering is an action. The essence of a number in intuition preserves the cumulative sense of repeated touching and discrimination of particular things. Measuring is the act of superposing one material thing on another. What wonder that the notions arising from such operations apply to their source, and enable the prophet to cry, as if inspired, that the Lord has ordered all things in measure and number and weight. These are the material categories bred in the mind by mechanical art, and whatever may be later their ideal elaboration, their validity in the field of action, which is the only existing world, remains conventional and pragmatic. An eye sensitive to physical light would have been useless to the organism, and incidentally never have endowed the spirit with the vision of brightness, were not light mechanically reflected and diversified by the earthly bodies on which it falls. Signals coming to the eye would not otherwise be prophetic or rougher contacts. Measuring is the act of superposing one material thing on another. What wonder that the notions arising from such operations apply to their source, and enable the prophet to cry, as if inspired, that the Lord has ordered all things in measure and number and weight. These are the material categories bred in the mind by mechanical art, and whatever may be later their ideal elaboration, their validity in the field of action, which is the only existing world, remains conventional and pragmatic. An eye sensitive to physical light would have been useless to the organism, and incidentally would never have endowed the spirit with the vision of brightness, were not light mechanically reflected and diversified by the earthly bodies on which it falls. Signals coming to the eye would not otherwise be prophetic of rougher contacts, nor would pictorial space otherwise have become what it is for human intelligence, an accurate and detailed map drawn according to a private projection and covering the field of action, or the home world of mankind. In consequence, when the sun rises, it not merely warms the backs of mankind as if they were lizards, but it clears away from the spirit half the terrors of precarious life. It suddenly extends the field of groveling search and opportunity to the horizon, the gift of specious light, great as it is but for this quicker adjustment to matter and this new safety expressed in it, since physical light is an instrument of reaction at long range. Specious light, its moral echo, has become almost a synonym for intelligence. The chief characteristic of pictorial space, which betrays its animal origin, is that it has a center. This center is transcendental. That is to say, it is not determined by any distinction in the parts of space itself as conceived, all of which are equally central. The dignity of being a center comes to any point of space from the spirit, which some fatality has lodged there, to the exclusion, at least in its own view, of all other places. These other places appear in that view as removed and ranged in concentric spheres at greater and greater distances. The cosmos of Ptolemy is the perfect model or Systemization of pictorial space. The choice of the Earth for a center, although arbitrary geometrically, was not arbitrary historically, because Ptolemy and all other beings found themselves on the Earth and were natives of it. So the fatality which always lodges spirit at some one point in nature and makes this its center is not arbitrary biologically, for wherever there is a living organism, it becomes a center for dramatic action and reaction, and thereby calls down spirit to assume that station and make it a moving vehicle for one phase of its earthly fortunes. Pictorial space therefore reappears wherever an animal rises to intuition of his environment, and in each case it has its moral or transcendental center in that animal, a center which, being transcendental or moral, moves wherever the animal moves, and is repeated without physical contradiction or rivalry in as many places as are ever inhabited by a watchful animal soul. The name of this relative center is here. Nature, if it has limits and is all measurable by a single measure, which may be doubted, may have a center, but not in the same sense as pictorial space. For here, in pictorial space, is a center of occupied position and actual reference, the determinant of far and near, forward and back, up and down, right and left. Animal categories imposed on the field of action by action itself, and impossible except in a perspective created by living intently in the act of looking, moving, or reaching out from an occupied center in a particular direction. This direction could not be chosen or even conceived except in sympathy with some organic impulse. In pictorial space, all structures and lines of cleavage crystallize about the axis of attention. The center of the cosmos, on the contrary, if it exists, would be determined by reciprocal material relations between its parts, and the choice of a starting point in surveying it never would shift that center, but only lead to it, as if to Rome, by a particular road. When an image of one's own body is included in pictorial space, as happens almost always in action, this image will roughly correspond with the center of that action in physical space. Vision will be centered in the moving hero and will follow him in his adventures. For even if nature as a whole has no center, every organism is a focus for its external and changing relations to the rest of the world, and it is the center of a dynamic cosmos relative to itself. Thus, pictorial space, spreading round its transcendental point of origin in the attentive spirit, affords a suitable index to that field of action which is its professed object, since the segment of nature implicated in that action actually surrounds and recedes from that action very much as pictorial objects surround the image of the body and seem to recede from it. In perception, as in painting, distortion is often the secret of significance. Pictorial space achieves something which might have seemed a miracle to a spirit acquainted with matter from the outside, but ignorant of the animal mind, which is the self-consciousness of matter. For pictorial space infuses into its object physical space an intrinsic reference to the station, the impulses, and the organs of the creatures ranging within it. This symbolic virtue hangs together with the transcendental status and graphic unity of pictorial space, by virtue of which it forms no part of physical space, but is a new whole symbol for it as a whole. The two belong to different realms of being, like Lucifer and the morning star, that yet bear the same name, and they are connected, not by interfering with or patching one another, but by a spontaneous concomitance and mutual implication, so that to find the one under certain conditions is to announce the other. Matter or physical space at certain nodes in its organization grounds and justifies the biased sensitiveness of animals to their environment, and this biased sensitiveness raised to intuition forms an ocular muscular perception of that very space. For the intuitions of animals at least in action, are not pure or contemplative, but by force of the intent involved in action, signify to the spirit the conditions of its existence, in this case the movement and feeling of physical space in that neighborhood. Sometimes, as in deep thought, no image of one's own body figures at all in intuition. Here, then, means whatever point in imagined space is the center of attention. Here may be the word on the page which I have reached in reading, or if my attention has passed from the words to the images awakened by them in my fancy, here may be Dante's Purgatorio, rising solitary out of a glassy sea and lifting its clear-cut terraces in perfect circles up to the fragrant wood at the summit, whence souls grown too pure for a mild happiness pass into the flame of heaven. Here is then, at the antipodes of Jerusalem and Calvary, halfway up from the center of the earth, which is the inferno, to the lowest of those concentric celestial spheres, each broader and more luminous, which, as Plotinus would say, are there. For in my contemplative mood, I should be regarding myself as directed away from the earth and from the hell in it, and in my pictorial space the eternal would seem to be the beyond. But now perhaps someone knocks at my door and disturbs my reverie. Here is now, if still a purgatory of a very different sort, is this room in this town where my body finds itself. I look out of the window, and now here is Paris. I notice on my table Baedeker's guidebooks and the Indicateur des chemins d'affaires, and I consider how easily here may be transferred to quite another geographical place. As to the here of a moment ago, it is not only not here, but it is nowhere. It belongs to Dante's imaginary world. It is a theme from the Symphony of Essence. The bond between pictorial space and physical space lies in the organ of intuition, which is a part of the agent in action. As this organ extends its instrumental uses, adjusting the organism at long range to its environment in physical space, so and in the same measure, the same organ exercises its expressive or spiritual function and creates a pictorial space for the spirit of the animal. This intuition is an important element in the total consciousness which that spirit can have of its destiny. It sets the stage in which the image of its body is found always occupying the center, and marks the vital distinctions of forward and back, up and down, far and near. Such relations, though obviously relative to an animal life, are not intransitive, as if they were the baseless invention of some impenetrable atom coming to life. They express a movement. Indeed, it is hardly conceivable that a point or an arrested structure should feel or think. The organ of intuition is rather so much of nature as is engaged in that movement and contributes to the choice of the essence which that intuition evokes. It might even be said that the whole universe is the ultimate organ of every intuition, as it is the ultimate object of every belief, but the measure in which this is true is most unequal. All intuitions, and especially that of space, take the point of view of some particular creature at some particular juncture, and if we wish to discover the special organ of an intuition, we may do so by internal evidence, noting the moral center of the given scene and its pictorial circumference, as we might those of a novel. The novel, unless it is an intentional travesty, will describe the country and age in which it was written, so the intuition will normally describe, and will always betray, that center of vital relations which is its seat and its author. Thus the degree in which the intuition transcends or ignores that center, becoming possibly an intuition of pure truth, will mark the degree in which its organ, though particular, is sensitive to the rest of nature. Besides a spacious center, here, pictorial space has a spacious scale. It contains a direct emotional sense of the large and small, the far and near. Size and distance are indeed so emotional that they are more than spatial, and touch the sphere of sentimental time. The far is redolent of the prolonged and dubious adventure of reaching it, and the large taxes the synthetic power of the eye, or the clasp of the extended arms. Pictorial space itself, especially when empty and considered absolutely, is the very model of vastness. It opens in all directions, something baffling to a hunting animal, and recedes to immeasurable distances. In its presence the breast expands, which is glorious, but the will halts, which is annihilating, and brings tears to the eyes. Therefore the oppressed souls of heroes sighed in Homer, looking into the broad heaven. The notion of the romantic infinite is a sublimation of this helplessness in applying a homely measure to unhomely things. From the practically inexhaustible we pass to the ideally immeasurable or infinite, and find it at once alluring and maddening, inevitable and dubious. Romanticism could not gloat on a more congenial abyss. The mystery of this mock infinite comes of importing into an essence, mathematically quite definite, the emotions of an explorer. The innumerable would present no difficulty if nobody was condemned to enumerate it, and nobody is. If nature is in some sense infinite, there will be substance found to occupy all its parts and establish their real relations. But the geometrical model of an infinite empty space is only a phantasm visiting the imagination, pictorial space washed clean, having no scale, no separable parts, and none but internal existence. Taken in this capacity, it is a perfectly clear and coherent object, a fact which confirms its specious character and derivation from a sensuous image, because if it were the essence of matter, as Descartes deputed it to be, it would hardly be clear or distinct to human apprehension. For matter, with all existence supported by matter, is unintelligible, if for no other reason, because it changes. The light of spirit which shines in the darkness cannot see the primeval darkness which begat it and which it dispels. But in so far as its strength avails, it consumes that darkness, as it were, for fuel, and sees that which was dark before by the light which it spreads over it. In this way, first pictorial space and then geometrical space are cast like a searchlight or a net over the field of action, to map and to measure it. But the principle of action, matter, in its native unison and flux, escapes intuition, and may be mapped and measured only externally, even if quite correctly and safely. This is possible because the darkness of matter is not chaotic or malicious. It does not circumvent the light which plays upon it, but only ignores it and lets it play on. That light is its own child, its own effluence. The harmony between the depths and the surface, the seed and the flower, is as natural as their diversity. Pictorial spaces are pictorial in various degrees. They range from the simplest essence of ecstaticity through all images of motion, collapse, swiftness, or scenic confusion, or they may culminate in a reposeful landscape, and in that essence of empty volume or immensity which, save for the absence of analysis, would fuse with the notion of geometrical space, perfectly obvious, but not at all geometrical, is the space revealed by internal sensations. When in one's inside something is felt moving, it would be hard to say what, where, or in how many dimensions. In dizziness and dreams, there are lapsing pictorial spaces. In semi-consciousness, there are unmapped, unrelated spaces waxing and vanishing. It is not only the latitude and longitude of visionary places that are unassignable, but their spatial quality that is unearthly. The talk about flatland and 4 dimensions is but a thin scientific parody of the uncertainty of animal sense. Even in rational human experience, the living intuition of space is endlessly qualified. There is the scene painter's space, divided into a few distinct planes in the direction of vision, but vague beyond and non existent behind the observer's back. At the theater, the house is not in the same place as the play scene, nor in the same time, unless you break the dramatic spell and substitute the material stage and the paid actors for the poetic world in which you ought to have been living. Even in real life, space for most men stops at the horizon, not sharply, for that would suggest a beyond, but a fancy merely dying out, so that a beyond is not needed, and in fact does not exist in that space. It was in this way that the ancients conceived a round heaven divided into concentric layers, without thinking of the infinity beyond. For the Empyrean, when that was invented, was rather an ocean of light than an abyss of nothingness. The views of storks about space, and they must be valid pragmatically, would doubtless baffle us altogether, and the logic of them might seem to us absurd when translated into our language. Our own topographical knowledge is the fruit of accumulation and synthesis, and doubtless true of nature as a whole, though perhaps less penetrating in some dimensions, and its precision renders us intolerant or forgetful of immediate experience even in ourselves. Only in tales or superstitions do we recover at times the elasticity of ignorance, and plunge innocently into as many pictorial spaces as may open out spontaneously before the mind. Even an intelligent man of action will sometimes stop to notice these unauthorized vistas, a humorous affection, as he might play with a child, yet they may be, in their sporadic way, shortcuts to things remote or future, incoherently but vividly reported, like Africa and Norway to the stork, and in any case they are collateral with the elements of our scientific conceptions. Some true indication is contained in any sensation, since something must have happened materially to produce it. But knowledge, synthesis, choice of a center, and range and apprehension are all adventitious to the existing object. They transfer it from physical to pictorial space, and transpose the parts of it perceived at all into terms of essence. Pictorial space is one of the dearest possessions of the human spirit. It would be thankless of us to be impatient because it is subjective, as if it ought not to have been so. It might no doubt have had a different sensuous texture, and might have conveyed much the same practical information in that other guise, but it could hardly have been more beautiful than, to the human eye, are the colors of the spectrum, the forms of motion, and the spheres of shadow and of light. If our senses had dogged more faithfully the steps of mutation in matter, we may doubt whether they would have rendered so well the results and scope of those mutations on the scale of the human body. In science, as in religion, little will be gained by an exchange of idols. Criticism would not be enlightened if it disgusted us with vision, or led us to quarrel with ideas because they are not things. Ideas are better than things, and one of the happiest fruits of existing in physical space is that pictorial spaces may be based upon it. The wise man is content with his native language. He would not be a better poet or a sharper judge than any other. Pictorial conventions would not have established themselves in the eye or brain if they could not be innocently and harmoniously associated with the business of life. They are to be smilingly welcomed, like strangers coming in the name of the Lord. But the Lord may presently send other messengers. Pictorial conventions may vary from age to age and in different races, even if the universe at large is not much changed. Yet this deeper possibility, too, should be remembered by a spirit that would not put all its eggs in one basket. The measure of descriptive truth now possessed by pictorial space need not always belong to it. Its beauty is its own, but if the world fell back into chaos and reconstituted itself differently, our pictorial space would have become obsolete. Other conventions would flourish and other peacocks would spread their tails, all to the greater glory of intuition, so long as intuition survived. I speak here impulsively of the future, but if the return to chaos were complete, if substance, which is the principle of continuity, were itself destroyed, then there would be no sense in saying that time in the second cosmos was future from the point of view of the first. This firstness and secondness would be reversible and imputed only because I, from the outside, happen to think of one world before the other. It would be substance in me that alone would actually have passed from the thought of one to the thought of the other, and only my intuition would have connected their essences in a specious time. As the space of neither world would lie in the space of the other, so the histories of the two worlds would run irrelevant courses, and be neither before nor after each other, nor simultaneous. For by physical time I understand an order of derivation integral to the flux of matter, so that if two worlds had no material connection, and neither was in any of its parts derived from the other, they could not possibly have positions in the same physical time. The same essence of succession might be exhibited in both. The same kind of temporal vistas might perplex the sentimental inhabitants of each of them, but no date in one would coincide with a date in the other, nor would their respective temporal scales and rates of precipitation have any common measure. The notion that there is and can be but one time, and that half of it is always intrinsically past and the other half always intrinsically future, belongs to the normal pathology of an animal mind. It marks the egotistical outlook of an active being endowed with the moral contrast produced by his momentary absorption in action upon the conditions and history of that action and upon the universe at large. A perspective of hope and one of reminiscence continually divide for him a specious eternity, and for him the dramatic center of existence, though always at a different point in physical time, will always be precisely in himself. Presentness is the coming, lasting, or passing away of an essence, either in matter or in intuition. This presentness is a character intrinsic to all existence, since an essence would not be exemplified in any particular instance unless it came into, or went out of, a medium alien to it. Such coming and going, with the interval, if any, between, constitute the exemplification of that essence, either in the realm of matter or in that of spirit. Thus, presentness, taken absolutely, is another name for the actuality which every event possesses in its own day, and which gives it its place forever in the realm of truth. But taken relatively, as it is more natural to take it, presentness is rather a name for the middle position which every moment of existence occupies between its sources and its results. This presentness is pervasive. A moment does not fail to be eternally present because it never was and never can be present at any other moment. This is the ubiquity of actuality, or if you will, of selfishness, because that very leap and cry which brings each moment to birth cuts it off from everything else. The rest becomes and must forever remain external to it, and this division is as requisite as this actuality. The moment does not, as if by some sin or delusion, cut itself off from some placid unitary continuum in which it ought to have remained embedded. It is not a fragment torn from eternity. On the contrary, its place in eternity is established by that severance. It is one wave in a sea that is nothing but waves. That from which it cuts itself off from it in turn, by the same necessity of its being, and every part of that remainder, with the very same leap and cry, cuts itself off from every other part. Now life is a rich and complex instance of this precipitation and self-assertion, and of this pervasive presentness. Intuition, when it arises within a physical moment, and expresses a passing condition of the psyche. Feelings and thoughts are parts of natural events. They belong to the self which generates them in one of its physical phases. Intuition creates a synthesis in present sensibility. is an act of attention occurring here and now. It has not intrinsically any miraculous transcendence, as if it spontaneously revealed distant things as they are or were or shall be. Yet in expressing the moment, intuition evokes essences, and these essences, coming as they come in the heat of action, are attributed as they are to the objects of physical pursuit or physical attention, which may bring tidings of facts at any distance. Within the life of the organism, this distance is primarily a distance in physical time, a distance which intuition synthesizes in the feeling of duration. For the animal psyche is retentive and wound up to go on. She is full of survivals and preparations. This gathered experience and this potentiality work within her automatically, but sometimes she becomes aware of them in part, insofar as she learns to project given essences and to develop spatial and temporal perspectives within the specious field of the moment. This feat is made easy by the frequent complexity of the specious field, in which one feature may be seen to vanish or to appear whilst others persist. The essence of change includes a direction in the felt substitution of term for term. It therefore includes the notion of the earlier absence of something now given, or of the earlier presence of something now absent. This is the very sense of existence and of time, and the key to all intelligence and dominion over reality. It contains the principle of transitive knowledge, since the present is aware of the past, and I in this condition think of myself in another condition, and it supplies an instance of transitive cognition, which is knowledge in the sense of being true, because the essence of transition given in intuition is elicited directly by actual partial transitions in the state of the psyche, and this psyche is a congruent part of nature, so that when the essence of transition given now is projected over all physical time, it is plausibly projected and has every chance of being true. Thus, sentimental time is a genuine, if poetical, version of the march of existence, even as pictorial space is a genuine, if poetical, version of its distribution. The views taken are short, especially towards the future. About being extensible, they suggest well enough the unfathomable depths of physical time in both directions, and if the views being views must be taken from some arbitrary point, they may be exchanged for one another, thus annulling the bias of each, insofar as the others contradict it. I am far from wishing to assert that the remainder or resultant will be the essence of physical time, but for human purposes a just view enough is obtained if we remember that each now and here is called so only by one voice, and that all other voices call it a then and a there. It is inevitable and yet outrageous that every day and year, every opinion and interest should think itself alone truly alive and alone basking in the noon of reality. The present is indeed a true focus, an actual consummation, insofar as spirit is awake in it, and it could not have a universal scope if it had not a particular foundation. To uproot intuition from its soil in animal life would be to kill it, or if somehow it were alleged to survive, to render it homeless in the realm of matter. The body is not a prison only, but a watchtower, and the spirit would live in darkness or die of inanition if it could not open the trap door of action, downwards towards its foundations and food and matter, or if it could not open the two windows of time, eastward and westward, towards rising or sinking constellations. It is no cruel fate, but its own nature, that imprisons life in the moment and prevents it from taking just cognizance of any other time save by a great effort of intelligence. If the present could see the past and the future truly, it would not feel its own preeminence. It would substitute their intrinsic essences for the essences of their effects within its own compass, or for its anticipations of them. It would thereby cease to be this waking moment in this animal life, and rise into a preternatural impartiality and ubiquity. For the double aerial perspective in which a living moment sees the future and the past is a false perspective. It paints in evanescent colors what is in fact a steady procession of realities, all equally vivid and complete. It renders the past faded and dead, and the future uncertain and non-existent. But this is egregious egotism and animal blindness. The past is not faded, except in the eye of the present, and the future is not ambiguous, except to ignorant conjecture. Yet it is only by conjecture or confused reminiscence that the present is able to conceive them. The present had to choose between misrepresentation and blindness, for if it had not seen the past and future in a selfish perspective, it could not have been aware of them at all. In the romantic guise of what is not yet or what is no longer, the fleeting moment is able to recognize outlying existences and to indicate to its own spirit the direction in which they lie. Flux, by its very essence, cannot be synthesized, it must be undergone. The animal egotism which gives it a center now and not then, contrary to fact, yet enables the passage from then to now, and from now onwards to another now, to be given in a dynamic synthesis, a synthesis which actual succession excludes. But without synthesis there is no intuition, no feeling, so that the sentimental perspectives of time are the only available forms in which a physical flux could be reported to the spirit. The least sentimental term in sentimental time is the term now, because it marks the junction of fancy with action. Now is often a word of command. It leans towards the future, and seems to be the voice of the present summoning the next moment to arise, and pouncing upon it when it does so. For now has in it emotionally all the cheeriness of material change. It comes out of the past as if impatient of not having come sooner, and it passes into the future with alacrity, as if confident of losing nothing but moving on. For it is evident that actual succession can contain nothing but nows, so that now in a certain way is immortal. But this immortality is only a continual reiteration, a series of moments each without self-possession and without assurance of any other moment, so that if ever the now loses its indicative practical force and becomes introspective, it becomes acutely sentimental, perpetual hope unrealized, and a perpetual dying. Various other modes of felt time cluster round this traveling now. Just now, for instance, is already retrospective, and marks a condition of things no longer quite in hand, already an object of intent and of questionable knowledge, yet still so near that any mistake about it would be more like an illusion of sense than like a false assertion. Just now is like a spoken word lingering in the ear, so distinctly that what it was may still be observed and described by inspection, and yet the description arising is distinguishable from it, and the two may be compared within the field of intuition. For though the voice is silent, I am still able to hear it inwardly, and its increasing uncertainty, its evanescence, is a notable part of what I perceive. At last the reverberation becomes inaudible, and I have only an image formed at intervals by silently repeating the word. If I am able to repeat it, it is not because I can mentally remember it, but I remember it mentally because I am able to repeat it physically. This muted repetition is thereafter my physical memory of what that sound was at its loudest. It suggests the glorious then, contrasted with this silent and empty now. The psyche is full of potential experience, pictures which she is ready to paint and would wish to hang. But the question is where, in those vast vague galleries of fancied time, she shall hang them. When the picture is composed and, so to speak, in her hand, but she can find no hook for it in the direction of action, she says, "Not yet." And unless she drops and forgets it, she may go on to say, "Soon," or "Someday." Or if, diabolically, the place it was about to occupy appears otherwise filled, she may cry, "Too late." There are corresponding removes and vacillations in the direction of the past where active impulses are not engaged. A risen image looks for points of attachment in the realm of truth. The sentimental mind would hardly entertain it, unless it could pass for somebody's ghost. A place can be found for almost anything in the fog of distance, and the most miraculous tale begins with once upon a time. There is hardly more definiteness, with added melancholy, in saying long ago. The event has sunk for sentiment below the horizon into the night where everything sleeps, which, though theoretically credited, is not relevant to present action. All, however, is not flaccidity and weakness in sentimental time. It has its noble notes in the sublime always and the tragic never. These terms, when true, describe facts in physical time, and their force comes from that backing, but not their sentimental color. For there is nothing tragic in the mere absence of anything from the universe, and nothing sublime in the presence there of such elements as may happen to be pervasive, like matter and change. The sublimity or tragedy comes from projecting sentimental time, with its human center, upon the canvas of nature. Never, then, proclaims an ultimate despair or relief. It professes to banish from the whole past or future some essence now vividly present to the mind, tempting or horrible, and the living roots of that possibility here in the soul render the denial of it in nature violent and marvelous. That something arresting to thought should be absent from the field of action causes a cruel division in the animal spirit, for this spirit can live only by grace of material circumstances, yet, being a spirit, it can live only by distinguishing eternal essences. Its joy lies in being perpetually promoted to intuition and confirmed in it, but it is distracted if its intuitions are thwarted and expel or contradict one another. Therefore, whenever the spirit finds some steadfast feature in the world, it breathes, even in the midst of action and discovery, its native air. That which exists always, even if only a type or a law, seems almost raised above existence, always assimilates time to eternity. Imagination then flatters itself that it dominates the universe, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. In fact, imagination can never synthesize anything but its own vistas, in a spacious, not a physical time. But if the vista had happened to be true, and if physical time had repeated endlessly the feature now singly conceived, thought would have marvelously domesticated that crawling monster, prescribing or seeming to prescribe how and how far it should uncoil itself. In respect to the whole flux of existence, such a boast is gratuitous, but it may be justified in respect to that field of action on which the spirit immediately depends. Spirit, however, scattered as its occasions and instances may be, is always synthetic in its intellectual energy or actuality. It gives the form of totality to its world. The frontiers may be vague and the features confused, but they could not be confused or vague if they were not features and frontiers of a single scene. Synthesis is a prerequisite to the sensation of change. An image of motion or a feeling of lapse is a single feeling and a single image. That exciting experience in which now keeps ringing like a bell would not be a strained experience of the mind, no more than so many fresh experiences, if the iteration were not synthesized, each stroke being received by a sensorium already alive, and as it were elastic, so that the dying strokes and others imminent formed with the fresh stroke a single temporal landscape, a wide indefinite now open to intuition, which psychologists call the specious present. This intuition no doubt has its basis in the datable physical moment, in a definite phase of the organism, but the temporal landscape given in it is ideal and has no date and no clear limits. Indeed, it is a miniature of all time, as imagination might survey and picture it. A few more details on the same canvas, a closer attention to the remoter vistas, and this specious present might contain all knowledge, all that the most learned historian or the deepest theologian has ever actually conceived must have come to him in the specious present. Unless action concentrates the attention on the forward edge of this prospect, on the budding now, the whole leans rather towards the past and grows more and more extended. It becomes full of things vain for our present purpose. Even when action or scientific observation rescue the specious present from this sentimentality, they leave it ideal and its field a purely sensuous unit. Action and scientific observation, though framed within the specious present in perception, ignore it in practice. But arts like music and eloquence are directed, without knowing it, to enriching this specious present and rendering it, in some climax, so overwhelmingly pregnant and brilliant that scientific observation and action become impossible. As if the flux of things had culminated, collected all its treasures, and wished at least for a moment to stop and possess them. Under such tension, when the spirit takes flight towards its proper objects, essence and truth, the body, which cannot follow, bursts into irrelevant action, such as tears or applause or laughter or contortions. Synthesis, which must be material before it can be spiritual, has then brought to a head more currents than can flow into any useful channel, and some random outlet must be found for that physical fullness and that physical impotence. Meanwhile, intuition shines in all its glory. On lesser occasions, when attention lights up some particular path in the field of action, spirit, being all eagerness and appetition, almost seems to be a form of energy or a source of motion and matter. But the fact that it is always wholly contemplative becomes evident in its richer moments. For then the specious present extends far beyond the urgent occasion for action, and may even drop its conscious relevance to the person or the hour, and at the same time its vistas will cease to be sentimental, because the survey of them will have become intellectual and impartially receptive. This specious present is dateless, but it is temporal. It is the vaguely limited foreground of sentimental time. In it, the precipitation proper to existence, the ticking of the great clock, is clearly audible. The bodily feeling of the moment is complicated in it by after-images of instants receding, and strained by anticipation of instances to come. As the psyche can synthesize in memory the fading impressions that reverberate within her, so she can prefigure and rehearse the acts for which she is making ready. A pleasant rumble and a large assurance thus pervade animal consciousness in its calmer moments. There is no knife edge here of present time, nor any exact frontiers, but a virtual possession of the past and even of the future, because the psyche is magnificently confident not only that a future will be forthcoming, but that its paces will be familiar and easy to deal with. In fact, she is quietly putting irons in the fire, and means to have a hand in shaping it. The general character of the future is felt to be as sure as the ebb and flow of the tide, whereas the rest of a sentence half spoken, and this assurance, which might seem groundless, is not so, because the psyche is not a detached spirit, examining the world by the light of some absolute logic. She is herself a material engine, a part of that substantial flux which exists only by bridging its intervals, and is defined as much by what it becomes as by what it may have been. That future, which is in part her product, is, in that measure, her substance transformed, or by its action transforming the surrounding substance. At bottom, then, the future is no new event, but the rest of this transformation. In an organism like the psyche, it is the present pregnancy of matter that determines the further development of its forms. Of course, this development may be cut short at any point by contacts with other organisms or with the inorganic, and then, if the psyche survives, she will be diverted in some new direction, at first violent and unpredictable. But if she could understand fully all the substance of which she is a portion, she would dominate in the specious present the remotest future of her universe, as well as its deepest past. For physical time is nothing but the deployment of substance, and the essence of this substance is the form which, if free, it would realize in its deployment. The psyche, then is not radically deceived in her somnolent confidence in the future, nor in her conviction that she helps to determine it. The future may be largely foreseen, or brought about as intended, even as the past may be largely remembered. The psyche has materials within the moment for both those temporal vistas. It is her egotism here that is in error rather than her faith, for the vivacity of her wishes or momentary fancies may obscure her sense for things at a distance, and beyond the chance limits of the specious present she may think the future indeterminate and unreal, and the past dead. The dead past? Certainly all years prior to AD 1920 are past at the time when I write these words, and all later years are future, and to me uncertain. Yet the reader knows that one of the years perhaps long subsequent to 1920 is as living and sure as 1920 is to me now. My problematic future will be his living present, and both presently a third man's irrecoverable past. There is no moment in the whole course of nature, unless there be a first and a last moment, which is not both future and past for an infinity of other moments. In itself, by virtue of its emergence in a world of change, each moment is unstably present, or in the act of elapsing, and by virtue of its position in the order of generation, both pastness and futurity pervade it eternally. Such double abysmal absence is the price which existence pays for its momentary emphasis. Futurity and pastness, the reproach of being not yet and being no longer, fall upon it from different quarters, like lights of different colors, and these same colors, like the red light and the green light of a ship, it itself carries and spreads in opposite directions. And these shafts cross one another with a sort of correspondence and contradiction. The moments which any moment calls past call it future, and those which it calls future call it past. Contradictory epithets of this sort are compatible when they are seen to be relative, but it must be understood that they are the relative aspects of something which has an absolute nature of its own, to be the foundation of those relations. And the absolute nature of moments is to be present. A moment which was not present in itself could not be truly past or future in the relation to other moments. What I call the past and what I call the future are truly past or future from here. But if they were only past or only future, it would be an egregious error on my part to believe that they were past or future at all, for they would exist only in my present memory or expectation. In their pastness and futurity, they would be merely specious, and they would be nothing but parts of a present image. If I pretended that they recalled or forecast anything, I should be deceived, for nothing of that kind, either in the past or in the future, would ever rejoice in presentness and exist on its own account. Thus, only false memory and false expectation end in events intrinsically past or intrinsically future, that is to say, intrinsically sentimental. False legends and false hopes indeed have their being only in perspective. Their only substance is the thought of them now, and it is only as absent that they are ever present. Romantic idealism, which saturates modern speculation even when not avowed, if it were not halting and ambiguous, would reduce all time to the picture of time, and establish the sophism of the present moment. And the present moment indeed includes and absorbs all sentimental time. Apart from its vistas, neither the past nor the future would be all romantic or unreal. Common sense admits this in respect to the past, the equal reality of the past with the present, and its fixity of essence, so that ideas of it may be false or true, are not seriously questioned. But in respect to the future, imagination is less respectful of fact, and flounders in an abyss to which it attributes its own vagueness. The prevision which the psyche often has of its future actions, as in planning or calculation, ought to give steadiness to thoughts of the future. inasmuch as here the causes of future events are already found at work, and the ancients, who were not sentimental, cultivated policy and prophecy, endeavoring to define the future through its signs and causes, as we define the past through its memorials. But modern anticipations are based rather on supposed laws, or on intuition of divine purposes, that is, on forms found in the perspective of events, as synthesized in imagination, whereby physical time is asked to march to the music which sentimental time may pipe for it. In reality, nature moves in a time of her own, everywhere equally present, of which sentimental time is a momentary echo. For sometimes a single pulse of substance may become conscious of its motion, and may fantastically endeavor to embrace the true past and the true future, necessarily external to it, in a single view. This sentimental agony, fancy, then transfers from its own flutterings to the brisk precipitation and the large somnolence of the general flux, which is neither regretful nor perturbed, and not intent on prolonging one of its phases rather than another. Animal life itself shares this conformity with the flux of things. Whenever animal life is perfect, and even perfect intuition shares it, by entirely transmuting motion into light, so that both in rude health and in pure contemplation it either forgets the past and the future altogether, or ceases to be sentimental about them, and learns to feel their direct and native reality as they feel it themselves.